Welcome to the conversation. Where did we come from? What is our purpose? And why do bad things keep happening to good people? These three questions have continued to dismay philosophers and theologians for years and are in many ways the inspiration for many of our scripture stories. Where did we come from and what is our purpose? I would refer you to Genesis 1 and 2. Why do bad things continue to happen to good people? Welcome to Job. Job is in many ways a record of this third question, asked and answered over the generations. It's not just one narrative story, it's a conversation. First is an old story. It's the first couple chapters of Job and then the very ending. It's an old story that really, if you read it, is different than the rest of the book in between, and it predates the answers. It's almost as if this old tale was there to wrestle with the question of why bad things happen, and then the Jewish community wrote their answers through these three friends who come to visit Job. And then a little later in chapter 32, we get an answer from a later generation with a post-exile answer to why do bad things happen. It invites us to ask the question for ourselves and answer it for ourselves. But to really walk through Job with these voices from generation to generation, we have to start at the beginning. Job starts out with a list of blessings, really. A litany of good behaviors, a testimony to Job's faithfulness. Job, the most righteous of all God's people. Then it goes sideways. Then the story goes sideways. God is bragging about Job to one of the heavenly beings. The Hebrew word here is ha-satan, the adversary or the advocate. Now, let's clear up one thing really quick. The Hebrew is ha-satan, and it gets translated as Satan. But that's not what it meant. David is referred to in the Old Testament as ha-satan to Saul, the adversary or the advocate. At this point, we don't have an understanding of good versus evil in it. There is no character of the devil or Satan in the Jewish community when this is written. This is a couple of heavenly beings debating the goodness of a mortal below that they've been watching. It's an ancient story at this point. And one of these heavenly beings, the Creator, is bragging about the faithfulness of Job. And ha-satan, the advocate or the adversary, the challenger, if you will, the prosecuting attorney in this story is saying, yeah, but he wouldn't be so good if you didn't pamper him so much. And then they kind of make a bet, Trading Places style, if you remember the old Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd movie where the two old rich men make a dollar bet over whether someone would change their criminal ways if put in a different circumstance. I imagine a dollar put down between the Creator and the advocate to how well Job will respond. At this point in our story, the advocate, the adversary, is given permission to test. Permission to test Job. The Creator allows this adversary to do anything except kill Job. Killing would be unfair, can't we all agree? So the adversary takes away everything Job loves. His family, his farm and livestock, his means to make a living, his home, and his health. Job is left sitting on an ash heap, a trash pile, if you will, the septic system and the trash can combined into one heap. And he's sitting there covered in oozing sores, scratching himself with a piece of pottery. Job is dismayed. He is in despair. He is broken. In the verses that follow, in the days that follow, we do get to see his friends, the friends that come to help. And in the text that we heard this morning, Job's friends do well by him. They sit with him. They grieve with him. They have empathy and compassion. When it first started, Job's friends did really well. And then as we keep reading, they start talking. And that's when things get worse. If you didn't think it was bad enough for poor Job, he has friends like these. When you read Job, I said you could tell there's a break in the style. It's not just in how it's written, it's the style it's written. As these friends talk, they don't speak in the same narrative that the beginning writer has. They have their own prose and verse. It's almost as if the shift to the friends' advice gets equally irritating, patronizing, and the tone and style of writing match it. It's a beautiful example of how we can see books of the Bible pieced together. So we have the opening narrative, and then the friends come, and this is the first word of advice. Eliphaz, the Temanite, answers, "If one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? But who can keep from speaking? See, you have instructed many. You have strengthened many a weak hand. Your words have supported those who were stumbling. You've made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Think now, who was it ever that was innocent that perished, or that were upright and was cut off? As I've seen those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." Basically, Eliphaz opens his mouth in the midst of Job's suffering and blames Job. But he did it very poetically, so we should forgive him, right? Then we get the second friend. Bildad the Shuhite answered, "How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind?" Clearly a compassionate friend. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against God, God has delivered them into the power of their transgression. So basically, friend number 2 blames Job's children, who just died, for all the problems that have been thrown upon Job. The third friend, Zophar, comes in at this point, and it's hard to figure out what Zophar has different to say. Basically, Zophar rambles on about metaphysical certitudes in a poetic way that basically sounds like he's the friend trying to sound as smart as the other two, but doesn't really have anything else to say. In the end, Zophar just sounds like he's jealous of his friend's big words and is getting in the conversation. The three friends, the three responses to Job and his suffering, represent an older understanding of suffering in the Jewish community. This ancient story is there, and then the people's answer is there. If something bad happened to you, it must be something you've done. And if you were good and you didn't do anything bad, then it must be your family's fault. And how many of us don't like to blame our family? Come on. It starts with the children, but this also applied to parents. So if something bad happened to you, it could be because your parents were unfaithful and you were being punished for it. Have you heard the expression, the sins of the father? This is one of those things where male dominance actually works out right for feminists, right? Nobody ever says the sins of the mother. The one place that it works out well in reverse, right? Eventually, though, we get a fourth verse, a fourth voice. A fourth person who's never mentioned at the end, which tells us this is a later addition to the text. Not only is the writing a little different, the thinking's different. And you can tell that through the exile experience, the understanding of the Jewish community has changed, and they've added an extra voice, an extra answer to the question. Why do bad things happen to good people? It's your fault. It's your kid's fault. It's your parents' fault. Elihu, the fourth friend, who seems to have been edited in later, chimes in with the suggestion that suffering can bring us closer to God. Does that sound like a lesson learned through the Jewish experience of the exile? The suffering all the way back to the Exodus? It fits their story and narrative, what they've learned over the years. God is present in the suffering, not causing the suffering. And it's a little closer to the way we understand God today. Now, there's another character that speaks in this story. You may have noticed there's been one character strangely absent in the speaking in this story, and that would be God. And God chimes in at this point and tells them all to hush. They've all spoken, they've all used their poetic phrase. Job has continued to mourn his own existence. Woe is Job, poor Job, speaking of himself in the third person. All the things we do when we're distraught, right? God comes in and says, I'm God and you're not. Get over yourselves. Then God restores all Job's stuff, and we're just supposed to ignore that it's a new family and new animals, and that's supposed to be even for the old ones, at which point we realize this whole thing wasn't as much a story, a historical account, as it was a grand metaphor, a grand parable, a way to ask a huge question that we can't wrap our brains around in a way that is narrative, that's personal. It gives us some characters so that we can engage the question with our little human minds. A great teaching tool, a generational conversation around this person of Job. So, what's our answer to the big question? And what can we learn from the answer of those who came before us? What's our answer to these big questions? We have the benefit of history. We have the benefit of years and years of reflection. We have our own suffering and that of history to compare. We also understand how the human brain works, how psychology works, how biology works. We understand scientifically some of the things that complicated this question in the past, but I don't think it gives us any clearer single answer than they had. What we're reminded of is that we are part of a generational conversation, and our voice is welcome at the table. So what do we learn from these texts in Job? For starters, we learn how to respond to those who are suffering, those who are wondering who to blame. We can be presence. We can be the very presence of God with them, present while they sort it out, without having to even open our mouths. For those who are questioning, who are wondering who is responsible for their lot in life, we can share our own ideas and affirm their own beliefs and thoughts. We can be present in the gray area of conversations and recognize the complexity that has always been a part of this conversation. For those who are blaming, dumping it all on God, or all of those swearing the devil made them do it, we can tell the story of Job with some authenticity and invite them into conversation, into self-reflection. We can invite them to remember that the question has always been more complicated than we would like. And then there's those who are judging. For those who are judging, we can remind them that God is God and they are not. Then we can pray with them. Pray for them. Just be with them as they sort out their own suffering, which often leads us to judge. And speaking of, when we are the ones judging, heaven forbid we would ever judge. When we are the ones judging, we can remind ourselves that God is God and we are not. Then we can pray for forgiveness and give thanks for God's grace and God's eternal presence in our suffering, in our joy, and in those who will gather around us. And finally, when we are the ones sitting on the ash heap, when we are the ones sitting on a pile of crud, sitting on a convergence of life moments that leave us feeling like we're scratching our oozing wounds with the broken pieces of our past, we're reminded to wait. To wait for friends. Wait for community. Wait for God to dwell with us and bring us comfort. Because God is God and we are not. God is God and we are not ever alone on the journey.